Summer 1976. A Sears department store in suburban Chicago. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, rows of shining appliances, and the smell of new carpet. Near the electronics section, a group of Soviet tourists stood in a tight cluster, notebooks in hand, watching American shoppers like scientists observing a strange species. They'd been taught that credit was a capitalist disease, a way to trap workers in endless debt. Then a middle-aged man in a plaid shirt rolled a 25-inch color television to the register. $479, nearly 2 weeks' wages. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a small rectangle of plastic, and handed it to the clerk. No thick stack of bills, no counting, no hesitation. The clerk pressed the card into a metal device, K-Chunk, and suddenly the TV belonged to him. Victor, a Soviet engineer, leaned forward and whispered to his group, "He's stealing it. Where are the police?" But no one came. The man signed a slip of paper, smiled, and walked out with a month's salary under his arm. Paid with a promise. If Americans could buy their dreams with a piece of plastic, what else had the Soviets been told that was completely wrong? Before we continue, hit subscribe for more Cold War stories that challenge everything we thought we knew. And drop a comment with where you're watching from and what time it is there. I'm genuinely curious how far these buried histories reach. The clerk behind the counter didn't flinch. He took the plastic card, placed it face up in a metal contraption that looked like a small printing press, laid a 3-part carbon paper slip over it, and slid a heavy bar across the top. Ka-chunk. The sound echoed through the electronics department like a rubber stamp on official documents, the kind of sound that meant something had been approved, authorized, made real. The clerk tore off the top copy and handed it to the man along with a pen. The man scribbled his signature without reading the numbers, folded his copy into his shirt pocket, and pushed the cart toward the exit. The whole transaction took less than 3 minutes. No manager appeared to verify the purchase. No one checked his identification against a list. No armed guard stepped forward to ask questions. The television, enormous and heavy in its wood-grain cabinet, simply became his property because a piece of plastic said it could. Viktor Mikhailovich stood frozen, his leather diary pressed against his chest. He was 42 years old, a mechanical engineer from Leningrad, and he'd seen factory floors that produced tractors and turbines and missile components. He understood systems. He understood how things moved from one state to another through authorization, documentation, and control. But this transaction that had just unfolded in front of him made no sense whatsoever. In his mind, the man had committed theft, or fraud, or some elaborate performance staged for the benefit of foreign visitors. He turned to the woman beside him, Lydia, a schoolteacher from Moscow with sharp eyes and a habit of asking questions no one else dared to voice. She was staring at the cash register, at the small placard propped next to it that read, "We accept Bank Americard, MasterCharge, American Express." Her mouth had fallen slightly open. "Did you see that?" Victor whispered in Russian, leaning close so the in-tourist guide wouldn't hear the alarm in his voice. "He gave them nothing. No money, just plastic." Lydia nodded slowly, still watching the man disappear through the automatic doors into the parking lot, the cart rattling across the pavement. Another Soviet tourist, a factory supervisor from Kiev, laughed nervously and said what they were all thinking. "It's a trick. They set this up for us, to show off." But even as he said it, another customer approached the register with an armful of kitchen appliances, a coffee maker, a toaster, a blender still in its box. She set them on the counter, and when the clerk called out the total, $163, she opened her purse and pulled out the same kind of card. Same metal device, same K-chunk, same signature on paper, same casual exchange as if this were the most ordinary thing in the world. No one in the store looked surprised. No one stopped to watch. This wasn't a demonstration. This was normal. Victor's heart began to beat faster, not from fear, but from the disorienting sensation of watching a system operate by rules he didn't understand. He'd been briefed before the trip, of course. The entire group had sat through orientation sessions in Moscow where officials explained American capitalism, warned them about decadence and waste, reminded them that they were representatives of the Soviet people and should conduct themselves with dignity. But no one had mentioned this. No one had explained that Americans carried loans in their wallets, that debt could be folded into a rectangle of plastic and used like money itself. He watched the second woman sign her slip, watched her smile at the clerk, watched her load her purchases into a bag, and walk toward the door without a trace of worry on her face. It occurred to him slowly that she might do this every week, that this might be how Americans lived. The sales clerk, a young man in his late 20s with neat hair and a name tag that read Tom, noticed the Soviet group staring. He'd probably seen foreign visitors before, people who stood too long in the aisles, who touched merchandise with a kind of reverence that regular customers never showed. He walked over with the easy friendliness that Victor had come to recognize as distinctly American, a casual warmth that felt both genuine and unsettling because it required nothing in return. Tom held up his own wallet, flipped it open, and pulled out a thin plastic card. "It's called a credit card, folks," he said, speaking slowly and clearly, the way people do when they're not sure if they're being understood. The in-tourist guide, Vera, stepped forward to translate, her voice calm and precise, smoothing over the strangeness. "A credit card," she repeated in Russian. "Kreditnaya karta." Tom continued, gesturing with the card as if it were the most natural object in the world. "Think of it like this. The bank pays the store today. The customer pays the bank back later, a little bit each month. See?" He pointed to the imprinter, the metal device still sitting on the counter. "We run the card through here, it makes a copy of the numbers, and the bank gets a record. Then at the end of the month, the customer gets a bill in the mail. If they pay it all at once, no problem. If they pay part of it, they pay a little extra, like interest on a loan." He smiled, tucking the card back into his wallet. "It's convenient. You don't have to carry a lot of cash around, and you can buy things even if you don't have the money in your pocket right that second." Victor felt the words land, one after another, assembling themselves into a picture that should have made sense but somehow didn't. The bank pays the store. The customer pays the bank. A little bit each month. He thought of his own salary, deposited into a savings book at the state bank, withdrawn in cash when he needed to buy bread or shoes or a ticket to the cinema. He thought of the waiting list for durable goods, the forms you filled out to request a refrigerator or a washing machine, the months or years you waited for your name to reach the top of the queue. He thought of his small apartment in Leningrad, comfortable enough, earned through his position at the factory, but furnished with items that had taken years to accumulate. And here, in this bright American store with its rows of gleaming televisions and stereos and appliances stacked 6 deep, a man could walk in on a Tuesday afternoon and walk out with a month's wages worth of goods because a bank trusted him to pay it back. Not because the state had approved him, not because a committee had reviewed his work record and political reliability, just because his credit was good. Lydia spoke up, her voice tentative but clear. "But how does the store know he will pay?" She directed the question at Tom, and Vera translated. Tom shrugged, still smiling. "They trust him. His credit is good. That means he's paid his bills before, so they figure he'll pay again. It's all tracked. If you don't pay, your credit goes bad and then you can't get another card. But most people pay. That's how the whole thing works." Victor watched Tom's face as he spoke, searching for signs of propaganda, for the rehearsed quality of an official explanation. But there was nothing. Just a young man explaining his job, explaining a system so embedded in daily life that he probably never questioned it. And that, more than anything, made Victor realize how deep the gap truly was. Americans carried debt in their pockets by choice. They chose to owe money not as an emergency or a failure, but as a strategy, a tool, a piece of everyday convenience. They bought televisions and furniture and vacations on promises to pay later, and somehow, impossibly, the whole economy ran on that mutual trust. That evening, back at the hotel, Victor sat at the small desk in his room and tried to sketch out the mechanics of what he'd witnessed. He opened his diary to a fresh page and drew a simple diagram with 3 boxes connected by arrows. Store, bank, Customer. The store gives the product. The bank gives money to the store. The customer gives money to the bank, later over time. On paper, it looked almost elegant, a closed loop of trust and obligation. But the more he stared at it, the more questions multiplied in his mind. What happened if the customer lost their job? What if they simply refused to pay? What if 100 customers, 1,000 customers, all decided at once that they wouldn't honor their debts? The entire system seemed to rest on a foundation of optimism that felt, to Victor's Soviet-trained mind, dangerously fragile. He wrote a single sentence at the bottom of the page. They have built an economy on belief that tomorrow will be better than today. The next morning, the group gathered in the hotel lobby for another day of scheduled tours. Vera, their guide, held a clipboard and announced the itinerary in her calm, measured voice. A visit to a local factory, lunch at a cafeteria, then more shopping, this time at a different department store. Victor noticed that several members of the group were quieter than usual, less willing to make jokes about American excess. They'd all seen the credit card transaction now. They'd all spent the night thinking about what it meant. During the bus ride, Lydia leaned across the aisle and asked Victor if he'd figured it out yet. "Figured what out?" he replied. She gestured vaguely toward the window, toward the passing streets lined with car dealerships and furniture outlets and restaurants with neon signs. "How they can afford all of this. I keep doing the math in my head. A color television in Moscow costs 700 rubles. That's 6 months of salary for a teacher like me. Here, that man yesterday, he spent less than 2 weeks of wages, and he didn't even have the money yet. He borrowed it." Victor nodded. "The prices are lower because they make more of everything. More factories, more competition, more efficiency. But yes, the credit card makes it possible to buy things you haven't earned yet." Lydia was quiet for a moment, watching the American suburbs roll past. "In our system, you wait until you've saved enough. Here, you buy first and hope you can pay later. I don't know which is worse, waiting or worrying." At the factory, they watched an assembly line produce small kitchen appliances, toasters, and can openers, machines stamping and welding and packaging at speeds that impressed even Victor's engineering sensibilities. But it was the company store at the end of the tour that brought the credit card question back into focus. Employees could buy the products they made at a discount, and the payment options were displayed prominently on signs throughout the showroom. Cash, check, or credit card. Installment plans available. No money down. Victor asked the plant manager through Vera's translation how many workers used credit to buy from the company store. The manager, a broad-shouldered man in his 50s with grease still on his hands from the floor, smiled and said most of them did. "It's easier that way," he explained. "They work here, they see the products every day, they want to take them home. Credit lets them do that without waiting 6 months to save up. And honestly, it's good for morale. People work harder when they've got something to show for it." Victor wrote that down. Work harder when they've got something to show for it. The logic was circular but undeniable. Credit created demand. Demand created production. Production created jobs. Jobs created income. Income paid off credit. Around and around, a system that fed itself as long as no one broke the chain. By 1976, there were over 56 million credit cards in circulation across the United States. Victor learned this from a newspaper article Vera translated for the group over lunch. The article included a chart showing acceptance rates at different types of businesses. Nearly every major retailer accepted cards. Gas stations had started installing card readers at the pump. Hotels required them for reservations. Airlines preferred them. The American economy had woven credit so deeply into its infrastructure that operating without it was becoming difficult, even suspicious. Victor thought about his own savings book back home, the careful entries recording deposits and withdrawals in neat columns. He'd never borrowed money in his life except for the state housing loan that every Soviet worker received, and even that was forgiven over time through loyal service. The idea of carrying debt voluntarily, of choosing to owe money when you didn't have to, felt reckless. But here, it was normal. Here, it was expected. The average American carried 2 or 3 cards, the article said. Some carried more. That afternoon at a shopping mall in the suburbs, Victor watched the checkout counters with new attention. He noticed the speed of transactions. In Soviet stores, buying anything substantial required 3 separate lines. First, you examined the item and got a slip from the clerk. Second, you took the slip to a cashier, paid and received a stamped receipt. Third, you returned to the original counter, presented the receipt, and collected your purchase. The whole process could take 45 minutes, sometimes an hour if the lines were long. Here in America, the entire transaction happened in one place. The customer brought items to the register. The clerk scanned or rang them up. The customer paid, usually with a card. Bagged, done. 8 to 12 minutes, start to finish. Victor timed it with his wristwatch. The efficiency was staggering. But efficiency, he realized, wasn't the same as fairness. Efficiency just meant the machine ran smoothly. It didn't tell you who the machine was built to serve. He wandered through the aisles of a large department store called Marshall Field's, his notebook tucked under his arm, trying to count the different models of television on display. He stopped at 30 and gave up. 30 different brands and sizes and price points, from small black and white sets for under $100 to massive color consoles that cost nearly $1,000. In Moscow, Gum carried perhaps 2 or 3 models, and those were often out of stock. Here, the abundance was overwhelming, almost violent in its excess. Every product came in a dozen variations. Every choice spawned 10 more choices. And threading through it all, making it accessible, was the credit card. Victor picked up a sales brochure near the television section. It advertised a 25-inch color TV for $479, the same model the man had bought the day before. At the bottom of the page, in smaller print, it listed the payment options. Full price in cash, or 12 monthly payments of $43, or 18 months at $30 per month. The brochure made it sound easy, convenient, manageable. It didn't mention interest rates, though Victor knew they had to be built in somewhere. It didn't mention what happened if you missed a payment. It just showed a happy family gathered around a glowing television, smiling together, living the life they deserved. The life they could have now, today, without waiting. Lydia found him near the checkout lanes, watching a young couple argue quietly over whether to buy a stereo system. The woman wanted it. The man was worried about their card balance. Victor couldn't hear the details, but he could read the tension in their postures, the way the man kept glancing at the price tag, the way the woman folded her arms and looked away. Finally, they decided to buy it. The man pulled out his card, handed it to the clerk, and signed the slip with a tight expression that didn't match the celebratory moment the purchase was supposed to represent. Lydia watched them leave, then turned to Victor. "They didn't look happy," she said quietly. Victor nodded. "No," he agreed. They looked worried. And for the first time since arriving in America, he wondered if the credit card wasn't freedom at all. If maybe, just maybe, it was a different kind of trap. The difference between Soviet and American shopping wasn't just about credit cards, it was about everything. The space, the light, the way products sat openly on shelves instead of locked behind glass counters. Victor had grown up standing in lines, and so had every other person in his group. Lines for bread, lines for meat, lines for shoes, lines for anything worth buying. You learned patience. You learned to spot a forming queue from a block away and join it before asking what was being sold, because if people were lining up, it meant something valuable had arrived. You brought your own bag because stores didn't provide them. You accepted what was available because choice was a luxury that existed only in propaganda posters. In Gum, Moscow's grandest department store, shopping meant navigating 3 separate transaction points, waiting at each one, hoping the item you wanted hadn't sold out by the time you returned with your stamped receipt. The whole process carried a weight of endurance, a sense that acquiring goods was something you earned through patience rather than something you simply did. Here, in American department stores, everything was reversed. The products came to you. You could touch them, pick them up, examine them without asking permission. There were no clerks guarding merchandise behind counters, no need to request that someone retrieve an item from a locked cabinet. Everything was self-service. Victor watched American shoppers move through the aisles with a casualness that still startled him after several days in the country. They picked up sweaters, held them against their bodies, put them back. They opened boxes, read labels, compared prices without any sense of urgency or scarcity. No one worried that the item might disappear if they hesitated. No one acted as though this shopping trip might be their only chance to buy a winter coat for the next 2 years. The abundance was so ordinary to them that they seemed almost bored by it. Scrolling through racks of identical shirts in slightly different shades, searching for some perfect variation that probably didn't matter. On the 4th day of the visit, Vera arranged for the group to spend an afternoon at a large shopping center outside Chicago. It was a Saturday and the parking lot was nearly full, rows and rows of cars glinting in the summer sun. Inside, the mall stretched in 3 directions from a central atrium, 2 stories of shops and restaurants and fountains with plants growing in enormous planters. The air conditioning was fierce, almost cold after the humid heat outside. Victor could hear music playing from hidden speakers, a soft instrumental version of a song he didn't recognize. The Soviet tourists walked slowly through the corridors, notebooks out, cameras clicking, trying to document what felt less like shopping and more like theater. One store sold only shoes, another sold only luggage, a third sold kitchen supplies, pots and pans and utensils arranged in gleaming displays that suggested cooking was an art form rather than a necessity. Lydia stopped in front of a shop that sold nothing but greeting cards, thousands of them, organized by occasion and sentiment. Birthday cards, anniversary cards, get-well-soon cards, thinking-of-you cards. She turned to Victor with a bewildered expression. "Who needs this many cards?" she asked. He had no answer. They found a Sears at one end of the mall, and Victor suggested they go inside because he wanted to compare it to the first store they'd visited. This one was larger, brighter, newer. The television section alone was bigger than some entire Soviet shops. He counted the models again and stopped at 40. 40 different televisions, each with a small placard listing specifications and prices. Most of the placards also listed financing options, as low as $29 per month. No money down. 90 days, same as cash. The language of credit was everywhere, so embedded in American retail that it had become invisible. Victor wondered how many of these televisions would be purchased with actual cash. How many Americans walked around with $500 in their wallet? Probably very few. The whole store, the whole economy was built on the assumption that people would buy now and pay later, that tomorrow's paycheck was as good as today's dollar. At the checkout area, Victor noticed a display rack filled with credit card applications, small postcards, bright and colorful, inviting customers to apply for store credit. Instant approval, some of them promised. Others offered special discounts for new cardholders, 10% off your first purchase, no annual fee for the first year. He picked one up and studied it. The application asked for name, address, employer, annual income, and social security number. That was it. No references from party officials, no verification of political reliability, no waiting period while a committee reviewed your worthiness. You filled out a card, handed it to a clerk, and within 10 or 15 minutes they'd call a number, check something, and either approve or deny you. The speed of it was astonishing. In the Soviet Union, applying for anything, a housing permit, a travel visa, a request to purchase a car, meant paperwork and bureaucracy and months of waiting. Here you could walk into a store as a stranger and walk out with the ability to borrow money, all in less time than it took to drink a cup of coffee. Lydia joined him at the display, picking up an application for herself. She read it carefully, her lips moving slightly as she translated the English in her head. "They make it sound so easy," she said. "Like anyone can have one." Victor nodded. "That's the point. The more people who have cards, the more people who can buy things, and the more people buy, the more the economy grows." She set the application back on the rack. "But what about people who can't pay? What about people who lose their jobs or get sick?" Victor had been wondering the same thing. The credit card system worked beautifully as long as everyone kept earning, kept paying, kept participating in the cycle. But life wasn't predictable. Factories closed, people got injured, marriages fell apart. What happened to the credit card holders when the cycle broke? He'd seen hints of it in the newspaper classifieds at the hotel, small ads offering debt consolidation, bankruptcy attorneys, credit repair services. The shadow side of the system, the part that didn't appear in the cheerful brochures or the television commercials. They wandered into the clothing section and Victor noticed an American family shopping together. A father, a mother, two children, maybe 8 and 10 years old. The mother held up a dress, showed it to her daughter, who shook her head. They moved to another rack. The father was looking at pants, pulling them off hangers, checking sizes. It all seemed so normal, so relaxed, until Victor noticed the tight set of the father's jaw, the way the mother kept glancing at price tags and putting things back. They weren't wealthy, he realized. They were working people, probably living paycheck to paycheck, trying to buy school clothes for their kids. And when they finally made it to the register with a modest pile of items, shirts and pants and one dress, the father pulled out a credit card. Victor was close enough to see the clerk swipe it through the imprinter, close enough to see the father sign the slip with a hand that moved just a little too quickly, as though he wanted the transaction finished before he could change his mind. The family left with their bags, the children happy, the parents silent. Victor thought about his own daughter back in Leningrad, 12 years old, growing fast. When she needed new clothes, his wife went to the state store and bought what was available. Sometimes the sizes were wrong. Sometimes the styles were years out of date, but there was no debt involved. You paid what you had or you didn't buy. Simple, secure, limited, yes, but also safe. Here in America, parents could give their children new clothes whenever they needed them, could fill their homes with appliances and furniture and toys. But the price wasn't just the number on the tag. The price was also the worry, the monthly bill, the calculation of how much you owed versus how much you earned. Freedom and anxiety wound together so tightly you couldn't have one without the other. On the 6th day of their visit, Vera announced that the group would be meeting an American family for dinner. It was part of the cultural exchange program, she explained, an opportunity for the Soviet visitors to see how ordinary Americans lived in their homes. The family had volunteered through a local community organization, and they'd agreed to host the group for an evening meal and conversation. Victor felt a mix of curiosity and discomfort. Official tours were one thing, controlled and predictable. But entering someone's private home, seeing how they actually lived behind closed doors, felt more intimate, more revealing. The family lived in a modest 2-story house in a residential neighborhood, the kind of street Victor had seen from the bus windows. Neat lawns, driveways with cars parked in them, trees lining the sidewalk. The father, Jack, greeted them at the door with a firm handshake. He was 35, maybe 40, with broad shoulders and grease permanently embedded under his fingernails. An auto worker, Vera explained. He worked at a plant that made engine parts. His wife, Carol, stood behind him, smiling nervously, wiping her hands on an apron. 2 children peeked around the corner, shy and curious. The house was small but comfortable. A living room with a couch and 2 chairs, a television against one wall, family photos on the mantel. The dining room table had been extended with the extra leaf to fit everyone, and Carol had prepared a meal that smelled like roasted meat and vegetables. They sat down together, and for the first few minutes the conversation was polite and careful. Vera translated, smoothing over the awkward pauses. Jack asked about the Soviet Union, about Moscow, about what life was like there. Victor and the others answered diplomatically, describing their work, their families, the things they were proud of. No one mentioned the shortages, the lines, the cramped apartments. That wasn't the kind of honesty this moment allowed, but as the meal went on and people relaxed, the conversation shifted. One of the Soviet visitors asked Jack about his job, and Jack explained that he'd worked at the plant for 12 years, that it was good work, steady pay, benefits. But then his face changed, and he said something that made Vera hesitate before translating. "It's been hard lately," Jack admitted. "I got laid off for 3 months last year. Plant cut production, had to let go of 100 guys. I was lucky they called me back, but some of my friends are still out of work." Carol set down her fork and looked at her husband, and Victor could see the tension pass between them, the kind of silent communication that happens between people who've had the same argument many times. Jack continued, his voice quieter now. When I wasn't working, we couldn't keep up with the bills. We'd bought a lot of things on credit. Furniture, appliances, the TV. Seemed fine when I had a paycheck coming in, but when that stopped, everything started falling apart. He pulled out his wallet and removed a credit card, holding it up for the group to see. It was a Sears card, the same store Victor had visited on the first day. "This thing," Jack said, "felt like freedom until it felt like a chain. I bought what my family needed. I wanted to give them a nice home, but I didn't think about what would happen if I couldn't pay it back. We missed 3 payments. Got letters from the collection agency. They threatened to repossess the furniture, the TV, everything. My credit score tanked, couldn't get approved for anything." He put the card back in his wallet and looked directly at Victor. "That card made me feel rich, but I wasn't rich. I was just in debt." The room went quiet. Victor could hear the clock ticking on the wall, the sound of someone shifting in their chair. He'd expected American propaganda, stories of abundance and success. Instead, he was hearing the opposite: failure, struggle, the human cost of a system built on borrowed money. Lydia leaned forward and asked through Vera's translation, what happened next? Did they lose the house? Did the family have to move? Carol answered this time, her voice steady but sad. "We worked it out," she said. "Jack's brother loaned us some money to catch up on the payments, and when Jack got called back to the plant, we made a plan. Paid off the cards one at a time. It took almost a year, but we did it. We still have the cards, but now we're careful. We only use them for emergencies." She glanced at her husband. "We learned the hard way. Credit isn't free money. It's borrowed time, and eventually time runs out." Victor wrote furiously in his diary, trying to capture every word. This was the contradiction at the heart of the American system. The credit card promised freedom, convenience, access to the good life, and it delivered, as long as everything went according to plan. But life didn't follow plans. People got sick, factories closed, accidents happened, and when the plan collapsed, the credit card transformed from a tool into a burden, from a promise into a threat. In the Soviet Union, Victor thought you had almost nothing, but what you did have, you owned outright. Your small apartment assigned by the state, your modest furniture purchased after years of saving, your simple possessions acquired slowly and kept for life. There was no abundance, no instant gratification. But there was also no collection agency, no repossession notice, no sleepless nights wondering if you'd lose everything because you'd missed a payment. After dinner, the group moved to the living room and the conversation continued. Victor asked Jack if he still believed in the credit card system, even after what had happened to him. Jack thought about it for a long time before answering. "Yeah," he finally said. "I do. Because the problem wasn't the card, the problem was me. I overspent. I didn't plan ahead. I thought the good times would last forever, and they didn't. But that's on me, not on the system." He leaned back in his chair. "In this country, you're free to make your own choices. Free to succeed, but also free to fail. The card is just a tool. You can use it wisely or you can use it poorly. I used it poorly and I paid the price. But I learned, and now I'm doing better." Victor respected the honesty, but he also heard the ideology underneath it: personal responsibility, individual freedom, the American belief that success and failure were products of character rather than circumstance. In the Soviet system, failure was often blamed on the system itself, on bureaucratic incompetence or structural problems. In America, failure was personal. You owned your mistakes. The factory supervisor from Kiev spoke up, his voice sharper than usual. "But what if you can't pay?" he asked. "What if you lose your job and can't find another one? What happens?" "Then?" Jack nodded slowly. "Then you're in trouble," he admitted. "You can declare bankruptcy, wipe out the debt, but your credit is ruined for years. Can't buy a house, can't get a loan, can't even rent an apartment in some places. It's hard. I've seen guys from the plant go through it. It destroys families. Marriages fall apart. People lose everything." He paused. "But that's the risk you take. Freedom isn't free. It comes with responsibility. And if you can't handle the responsibility, you suffer the consequences." Victor watched Jack's face as he spoke, seeing the pride and the pain mixed together. This was a man who'd nearly lost everything but had clawed his way back. He believed in the system because he'd survived it, because his story had a redemption arc. But Victor wondered about the people whose stories didn't have happy endings, the ones who declared bankruptcy and never recovered, the ones who fell through the cracks. As the evening ended and the group prepared to leave, Jack walked Victor to the door. They stood together on the front step, the summer night warm and quiet around them. Jack extended his hand and Victor shook it. "I know our systems are different," Jack said. "I know you probably think we're crazy, living on borrowed money, but it works for us. Most of the time, anyway. We get to have things now instead of waiting years. We get to live the life we want, not the life someone else tells us we can have." Victor nodded. "I understand," he said in careful English. "In my country, the state decides when you are ready to buy. Here you decide, and you live with the choice." Jack smiled. "Exactly. For better or worse, it's our choice." They stood there for another moment, two men from opposite sides of the world, both trying to understand systems that made sense from the inside but looked insane from the outside. That night, Victor couldn't sleep. He lay in his hotel bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of traffic outside. The visit to Jack's house had shaken something loose in him, a certainty he'd carried since childhood about how the world should work. He'd been raised to believe that the Soviet system, for all its flaws, represented the future. That collective ownership and state planning would eventually surpass the chaos and inequality of capitalism. That the American way of life, built on competition and individual struggle, would inevitably collapse under its own contradictions. But after a week in America, watching ordinary people buy televisions with plastic cards, watching families navigate debt and recovery, watching a system that shouldn't work, somehow function anyway, he wasn't sure what he believed anymore. He reached for his diary on the nightstand and opened it to a blank page. The pen felt heavy in his hand. He wrote slowly, in careful Cyrillic, "In America, they trust strangers with money. In Moscow, we trust the state with our future. Both systems ask us to believe in something we cannot see." The next morning, the group gathered in the hotel lobby for their final scheduled event, a visit to a community credit union. Vera explained that credit unions were different from banks, smaller and member-owned, focused on serving local communities rather than making profits. Victor wasn't sure what to expect. Part of him was tired of thinking about money and credit and debt. Part of him wanted to spend the last day just walking around, looking at the city, letting the experience settle without trying to analyze it. But Lydia was excited. She'd been asking questions all week, pushing against the easy explanations, and she'd specifically requested this visit. She wanted to understand how the system worked from the inside, from the people who ran it. The credit union occupied a modest building on a quiet street, nothing like the imposing marble banks they'd seen downtown. Inside, it was plain and functional. Desks, filing cabinets, a counter where members could make deposits and withdrawals. A woman in her early 50s greeted them with a warm smile. Her name was Margaret, and she was the manager. She'd worked in banking for nearly 30 years, she explained through Vera's translation, and had seen the credit card system grow from a novelty into an essential part of American financial life. Margaret invited them into a conference room and spread out papers on the table. Ledgers, statements, charts showing loan repayment rates. She spoke with the calm precision of someone who knew her subject deeply and had nothing to hide. "Credit unions work on a simple principle," she began. "Our members pool their savings, and we lend that money back to members who need it. We charge interest, but it's lower than banks because we're not trying to make a profit. We're trying to help people." Victor leaned forward, studying the charts. The numbers told a story. Thousands of loans issued every year. Car loans, home loans, personal loans, and credit cards, hundreds of them, issued to members with good standing. The repayment rate was high, 98.5%. Most people paid back what they borrowed. Margaret saw him looking at the number and nodded. "That's the key," she said. "Credit works because most people are honest. They want to pay their debts. They take the responsibility seriously. Yes, some people default. Some people can't pay because life gets hard. But that's a small percentage. The system absorbs those losses because the majority of people come through. Lydia asked the question that had been bothering Victor for days. What about the people who don't pay? The 1.5%? What happens to them? Margaret's expression softened. It depends, she said. Sometimes it's a temporary problem. They lose a job, we work with them, maybe postpone payments for a few months until they get back on their feet. Sometimes it's more serious. Medical emergency, divorce, something that destroys their finances completely. In those cases, we have to write off the debt. It hurts them, hurts their credit for years. But we don't want to destroy people. We want to help them recover. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The credit system reflects a choice we've made as a society. We believe in giving people opportunity, even if that means accepting some risk. We believe most people will use that opportunity responsibly, and the numbers prove we're right. Not perfect, but right most of the time. Victor felt something shift in his understanding. For a week, he'd been seeing credit cards as either liberation or exploitation, trying to decide which side was true. But Margaret was describing something more nuanced. A system built on measured optimism, on calculated trust. The banks and credit unions bet on human decency, and they won that bet 98.5% of the time. The losses were real, the failures were real, but they were the acceptable cost of a system that gave millions of people access to things they couldn't afford up front. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't fair to everyone. But it worked in its flawed human way. He thought about the Soviet system, where the state guaranteed employment but couldn't guarantee goods, where everyone was equal but equally limited, where security came at the price of scarcity. That system also made a bet, a different kind of bet. It bet that central planning could distribute resources more fairly than markets. It bet that collective ownership would eliminate exploitation, and by some measures it worked too. No one starved. No one lived on the street. Everyone had a job, a place to live, access to basic necessities. But no one had abundance either. No one had choice. The state decided what you could have and when you could have it, and you waited. The factory supervisor asked Margaret a pointed question. But your system creates inequality. Some people can borrow more because they earn more. Rich people get richer. Poor people stay poor or go into debt trying to catch up. Margaret didn't flinch. That's true, she acknowledged. Credit cards don't solve inequality. They might even make it worse. If you're wealthy, credit is cheap and easy. If you're struggling, credit is expensive and hard to get. The system favors people who already have advantages. That's a real problem, and I won't pretend it isn't. She spread her hands on the table. But the alternative isn't necessarily better. In a system where no one can borrow, where everyone has to save up before buying anything, poor people are even worse off. They wait longer. They go without. At least with credit, they have a chance, even if that chance comes with risk. Victor wrote that down. At least with credit, they have a chance. It was the American philosophy in miniature: opportunity with risk, freedom with responsibility, the chance to rise, and the possibility of falling. As the meeting ended, Victor approached Margaret privately. He pulled the credit card application from his pocket, the one he'd picked up at Sears days ago. He'd been carrying it around, folded and creased, unable to throw it away, but also unable to decide what it represented. He showed it to Margaret and asked in halting English, "If I live here, I apply, I get card?" Margaret smiled gently. "If you lived here, had a job, had a social security number, yes, you could apply. Might get approved, might not. Depends on your income, your history. But you'd have the chance." Victor looked at the application one more time, then carefully folded it and put it back in his pocket. He wasn't going to fill it out. He was going home in 2 days, back to Leningrad, back to his job at the factory, back to a life where credit cards didn't exist. But he wanted to keep it, a souvenir, a reminder that he'd seen another way of living, another way of solving the problem of how ordinary people get the things they need. That afternoon, the group returned to Jack's neighborhood. They'd asked if they could visit again, and Jack and Carol had agreed. This time, the conversation was easier, more relaxed. The children showed them their rooms, their toys, their collections of books and games. Victor noticed that some of the furniture in the house had small tags still attached, remnants of the credit purchases Jack had described. A couch, a dining table, things that had nearly been repossessed but were now paid off, owned free and clear. Jack walked Victor through his monthly budget, showing him on paper how much he earned, how much he spent, how much he put toward savings now that the credit cards were under control. It was a life balanced on a narrow edge, one unexpected expense away from trouble. But it was also a life filled with comfort and possibility, things that would have taken decades to accumulate any other way. As they prepared to leave for the final time, Jack and Victor shook hands again on the front step. "I hope you got what you came for," Jack said. Victor nodded. "I did," he replied. "I understand now. Not agree maybe, but understand." Jack smiled. "That's all anyone can ask."